Somewhere in southern Iraq, beneath a mound that the wind has shaped and reshaped for 6,000 years, there are fish bones scattered around an altar. They were left there by hands we will never see in a ritual we will never fully understand, for a god of fresh water and secret knowledge whose name has outlived every empire that tried to erase it. The mound is called Tel Abu Shahrain now. The people who built its first temple called the city Eridu, and in the oldest written records of human civilization, this place was remembered as the location where kingship descended from heaven. Not a metaphor for gradual development, not a poetic flourish, a declaration pressed into clay and repeated across 4,000 years of Mesopotamian scribal tradition that something extraordinary had come down from above and taken root in this unlikely patch of marshland. Tonight, we are going to follow that declaration backward in time, through layers of excavated temple floors and translated tablets, through the strange figures carved on palace walls, and the even stranger numbers inscribed on ancient king lists. We are going to meet the beings the Sumerians called the Apkallu, the fish-cloaked sages who emerged from the waters before the Great Flood to teach humanity everything it needed to know. And we are going to trace how those sages transformed, across languages and centuries and competing ideologies, into the watchers of Hebrew tradition, the rebellious angels who fell from grace for sharing forbidden knowledge. This is not a story with simple answers. The more carefully we look at the evidence, the more layers appear beneath each layer. Archaeological findings complicate the ancient texts complicate each other, and the question at the heart of all of it, the question that civilizations across the ancient world wrestled with and never quite resolved, remains as unsettled tonight as it was 5,000 years ago. Where does knowledge come from? Is wisdom a gift from heaven or a theft from the gods? Are we elevated by what we learn or corrupted by it? Settle into whatever position feels right for your body. If you are listening to fall asleep, know that you do not need to follow every detail. The names will blend, the dates will drift. The marshlands of ancient Mesopotamia will become the mountains of Canaan, will become the temples of Babylon, and you can let them wash together like water finding its own level. The story keeps moving whether your eyes are open or closed. Let us begin where the Sumerian king list begins. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu was not an obvious place to build a civilization. It sat at the edge of the marshes in what is now southern Iraq, near the head of the Persian Gulf, where fresh water from underground aquifers met the brackish water of the delta. The land was flat. The soil was alluvial, deposited by rivers that flooded unpredictably. There was no stone for building, no metal ore for tools, no timber for construction. Everything that would eventually make Mesopotamian civilization famous, the ziggurats and the cylinder seals and the bronze weapons, would have to be imported from elsewhere or invented from nothing. And yet, between 46 and 1949, when archaeologists Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd excavated the mound at Tel Abu Shahrain, they discovered something that fundamentally changed our understanding of when and how civilization began. Beneath a later ziggurat, they found 17 superimposed temple levels. 17 temples, built one on top of another across nearly 5,000 years, each new structure incorporating the ruins of the one before. The earliest shrine, a simple mud brick structure measuring just 3 meters by 2 meters, had been built directly on virgin sand around 5400 BCE. That is more than 1,000 years before the Great Pyramids of Giza, more than 2,000 years before the earliest written texts. What I want to slow down here and emphasize is what they found around that earliest altar: fish bones, offerings left for a deity associated with fresh water and wisdom, in a shrine so ancient that the people who built it had not yet invented writing to tell us his name. But 4,000 years later, when scribes finally did write down the religious traditions of this region, they remembered the god of Eridu as Enki, lord of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, keeper of the divine powers called the Me, and creator of the 7 sages who taught humanity civilization. The fish bones were not accidental debris. They were evidence of continuous worship, the same deity honoured in the same location across 5 millennia. Whatever the people of Eridu believed about the source of their knowledge, they believed it consistently and passed it down with remarkable fidelity. The location itself may have held special significance beyond its access to fresh water. The marshes, where Eridu sat, were liminal spaces, neither fully land nor fully water, regions where the boundaries that structured ordinary life became ambiguous. Such places have been associated with sacred power in cultures around the world. The threshold between categories, between dry and wet, between cultivated and wild, becomes a space where transformation is possible, where beings from other realms might appear, where the ordinary rules might be suspended. The fish-cloaked sages who emerged from these waters were appropriate to their setting. They belonged to both realms, human in form but cloaked in the element from which they came. Their dual nature matched the dual nature of the landscape. Whatever knowledge they brought crossed the same boundary they themselves had crossed, moving from the depths where ordinary humans could not survive to the dry land where civilization would take root. Now, there is a popular narrative, one that you may have encountered in alternative history, circles that suggest Sumerian civilization appeared suddenly and fully formed, as if someone had simply deposited advanced technology in the marshes overnight. This narrative takes the sophistication of later Mesopotamian achievements, the writing, the astronomy, the complex architecture, and reads it backward onto the earlier settlements, suggesting that such advancement could only have come from outside intervention, whether divine or extraterrestrial. The archaeological evidence tells a more patient story. Those 17 Templar levels at Eridu span approximately 2,000 years. The earliest shrines are tiny and simple. By level 6, a more sophisticated tripartite temple plan emerges, with a central hall flanked by smaller rooms, a form that the Italian archaeologist Mario Liverani noted by far superseded anything ever built until then. But that development took centuries. The jump from simple shrine to sophisticated temple was not instantaneous. It was incremental, each generation building on what the previous generation had learned, each improvement preserved in mud brick and then built over by the next. This pattern of gradual development matters because it changes how we read the ancient texts. When the Sumerians wrote that the Apkallu taught humanity civilization, they may not have been claiming that advanced knowledge arrived overnight from the sky. They may have been encoding in mythological language the fact that knowledge was transmitted, that it came from somewhere before and was passed down to those who came after. The fish-cloaked sages emerging from the waters could be a poetic way of describing what the fish bones around the altar already suggest. Continuity, transmission, the careful handing down of sacred techniques across generations, or they could be describing something else entirely. That is the difficulty with ancient texts. They invite interpretation, but they resist certainty. Let your shoulders release. Let your jaw unclench. The marshes of Eridu are 6,000 years away, and you are exactly where you need to be. 200 miles to the northwest of Eridu, another city was growing. By 3100 BCE, Uruk had become the largest urban centre in the world, with an estimated 80 to 90,000 people in the city and its surrounding settlements. 250 hectares of dense urbanisation, temples and workshops and administrative buildings, in an age when most human beings still lived in villages of a few hundred at most. And it was at Uruk, in the precinct called Eanna, that archaeologists found the earliest known writing. Approximately 6,000 proto-cuneiform tablets, dated to around 350–300 BCE, recording not prayers or myths, but inventories, lists of commodities, counts of animals, grain distributions. The first writing was bookkeeping. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The popular imagination tends to associate writing with sacred knowledge, with priests recording, divine revelations or sages inscribing cosmic secrets. And that association is not entirely wrong. Later cuneiform would preserve religious texts, astronomical observations, medical treatises, and epic poetry. But the earliest writing we have found was administrative. It emerged from economic complexity, from the need to track resources in a city too large for any single person to hold in memory. The invention of writing appears tied to practical necessity rather than mythological transmission. The earliest tablets are not records of the Apkallu's teachings, they are receipts. And yet, the tradition that remembered writing as a gift from the sages was also recorded in writing, preserved on clay for thousands of years, copied by scribes who explicitly claimed to be continuing a lineage that stretched back before the flood. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king whose library yielded tens of thousands of tablets, boasted in his colophons of enjoying the writings on stones from before the flood. Nebuchadnezzar Samtizer described himself as seed preserved from before the flood. These were not metaphorical claims. They were assertions of legitimate succession to antediluvian wisdom. Something was being transmitted. The scribes believed it, and they built institutions to ensure that the transmission continued. The training of a scribe took approximately 12 years, beginning before the age of 10. Students in the Adapa, the house where tablets are passed out, learned over 600 cuneiform characters, progressing through sign lists and lexical series and mathematical exercises before finally being permitted to copy literary texts. Archaeological evidence from House F at Nippur yielded over 1,400 tablet fragments documenting this educational process. Practice exercises where students copied the same passages again and again until the signs became automatic. This was a knowledge preservation infrastructure of remarkable sophistication. The same scribal traditions that trained generation after generation in the craft of the stylus also preserved and transmitted the stories of the 7 sages. The Apkallu may be mythological, but the scribal networks that told their stories were real institutions with documented historical existence. You do not need to hold all of this. Let the temple levels stack like sediment in your mind. Let the numbers blur into impression. 17 shrines, 6,000 tablets, 12 years of training. The precision will soften into atmosphere if you let it. The canonical 7 sages are named. In the Uruk list of kings and sages, a tablet discovered in Mu59 at the Bitresh temple and dated to the Seleucid era, around 165 BCE. This is a late text, more than 2,000 years after the earliest Eridu temple, but it preserves traditions that appear in much older sources. The Akkadian term Apkallu derives from Sumerian Apgal-lu, with Ab meaning water, Gal meaning great, and Lu meaning an. Great ones of the water, creatures of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, created by Enki to serve as civilizational instructors. Their names carry epithets that describe their functions. Euanna, also known as Adapa and later as Oannes in Greek sources, was called he who accomplishes the plans of heaven and earth. Euannaduga was endowed with comprehensive understanding. Enmegalama was born in a house. Enmebuluga grew up in pasture land. And Enlilda was the conjurer of the city of Eridu. The last of the 7, Utuabzu, was described as he who ascended to heaven. Each sage was associated with a corresponding antediluvian king. Adapa served Alulim of Eridu. Utuabzu counselled Enmeduranki of Sipar. The pairing of sage and king, wisdom and power, established a template that would echo through later traditions. The 7th sage ascending to heaven parallels the 7th biblical patriarch Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. Scholars like Helga Kvanvig have demonstrated that both figures derive from the same Mesopotamian tradition, the 7th sage or king receiving celestial secrets and being translated to heaven. But here I want to be careful about a detail that often gets oversimplified in popular accounts. You may encounter sources that translate the Sumerian term IGI, meaning eye, as evidence that these beings were called watchers in the original cuneiform. The connection between IGI and the later Hebrew term for watcher is speculative etymology rather than established Assyriology. The Agigu, a class of divine servants who appear in texts like the Atrahasis Epic, are translated from the logogram Nund Gal Ine as great princes or sovereigns. Their defining characteristic in the texts is not watching but labouring and later rebelling against that labour. The explicit watching function develops later, in Aramaic and Greek translations, and represents a transformation of the tradition rather than a preservation of its original meaning. The transformation matters because it reveals something about how ideas change as they cross linguistic and cultural boundaries. What the Mesopotamians celebrated, what the Jewish scribes condemned, what the Greek historians recorded, these are not the same story. They are versions of a story, each shaped by the concerns and ideologies of its tellers. Rest now in the uncertainty. The sages rise from the water. Their names drift like reed boats on the current. You do not need to catch them all. The most detailed account of the first sage, Oannes, comes from a Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing around 281 BCE for a Greek audience. Berossus's original text, the Babyloniaca, has been lost, but fragments survive in quotations by later historians. According to these fragments, Oannes was an amphibious creature with the body of a fish containing a human head and human feet, who emerged from the Persian Gulf and spent days among men without eating. The teachings attributed to Oannes are comprehensive. Letters, mathematics, city construction, temple founding, lawmaking, agriculture. everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize mankind. And then the remarkable claim, from that time nothing material has been added by way of improvement. This is a civilization ideology encoded in mythology. All essential knowledge, according to this tradition, predated the flood. Everything that came after was transmission, preservation, recovery of what the sages had already taught. Progress was not innovation, but restoration. Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs from the 9th century BCE provide visual evidence of how these figures were imagined. At Nimrud, in the palace of Ashur-nasir-pal II, 3 distinct types of Apkallu appear carved in stone: human figures with wings and horned helmets, bird-headed beings with human bodies, and fish-cloaked figures, with the fish head visible as a kind of hood or cape atop a human form. All of them typically carry the same ritual implements. In the left hand, the bandudu, a ritual bucket. In the right hand, the mulilu, a cone-shaped purifier. These implements appear again and again in apotropaic contexts, used for rituals involving holy water aspersion, protection against demons and disease. Clay figurines of the Apkallu were manufactured in groups of 7 and buried in temple foundations at Assur, Nimrud, and Nineveh, viz. For protective purposes. The sages were not merely remembered, they were invoked. Their power was considered active, available for ritual deployment against the forces of chaos and contamination. Let the fish-cloaked figures stand at the threshold. Let them guard whatever needs guarding in your dreaming mind. The ritual bucket and the purifying cone are older than any language you speak, but something in them might still recognize something in you. The Adapa myth, preserved in fragmentary tablets from the 14th century BCE at Tel El Amarna, the 7th century BCE at the Library of Ashurbanipal, and most anciently from the 19th to 16th century BCE at Mitaran, presents the quintessential tale of human wisdom approaching but not quite reaching divine status. Adapa was a priest of Enki's temple at Eridu. He possessed wisdom granted by his divine patron, but not eternal life. The story pivots on a fishing accident. While out on the water, the south wind capsized his boat. In anger, Adapa broke the wings of the south wind, preventing it from blowing for 7 days. This was not a minor offence. The winds were cosmic, forces, their rhythms essential to the order of the universe. Anu, the supreme god, summoned Adapa to heaven to account for his disruption. Before he departed, Enki gave him instructions: wear mourning garments, flatter the gatekeepers Tammuz and Ningishzida by lamenting their departed divinity, but refuse any food or drink offered, as it would be food of death. Adapa followed the instructions. The gatekeepers, charmed by his mourning for them, interceded with Anu on his behalf. Anu, impressed by the mortal's wisdom, offered something unexpected: the bread of life and the water of life, immortality itself. Adapa refused following Enki's warning. Anu, astonished, dismissed him back to earth, forever mortal. The ambiguity of this story has fascinated scholars for more than a century. Was Enki's warning protective, a father figure guarding his protege from divine treachery? Or was it deliberate deception, ensuring that humans would never cross the boundary into divinity? The text does not resolve the question. It holds both possibilities in suspension, the god of wisdom either protecting or tricking the wisest of mortals. This pattern recurs throughout ancient Near Eastern literature. Humans approach divine knowledge but remain barred from divine status. Gilgamesh finds the plant of immortality only to have it stolen by a serpent. The builders of the Tower of Babel reach toward heaven only to be scattered and confused. The boundary between mortal and divine is permeable to knowledge, but impermeable to being. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous literary work to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, explores this boundary with particular poignancy. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid whose divine proportion gives him extraordinary power but does not exempt him from the human condition. After the death of his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh sets out on a quest for immortality, seeking the one human who ever achieved it, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor whom the gods had granted eternal life. The journey takes Gilgamesh beyond the edges of the known world, through regions of darkness, across the waters of death. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, he hears the full account of the flood, the only complete version that survives from Mesopotamian tradition. Utnapishtim's immortality, he learns, was a one-time gift, granted because of the unique circumstances of the flood. It cannot be repeated. There is no path to eternal life for Gilgamesh. But Utnapishtim's wife persuades her husband to offer the exhausted king something, knowledge of a plant that grows on the seafloor, which will restore youth to whoever eats it. Gilgamesh dives to retrieve it, succeeds, and begins the journey home with the plant that could transform human existence. He never uses it. At a pool of cool water, a serpent smells the fragrance of the plant, rises from the water, and steals it away. The serpent sheds its skin, renewed, and Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. Everything he endured, everything he risked, ends in loss. The story does not offer consolation of the usual kind. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk without immortality, without the plant of youth, with only the knowledge of his own mortality and the walls of his city, which the story invites us to admire. The conclusion suggests that what endures is not the individual life, but what that life creates. The walls of the city, the tablets that preserve the story, the civilization that continues, after the king who built it has died. This is a different answer to the question of what wisdom offers, not escape from the human condition, but the capacity to shape what we leave behind. The Apkallu taught city construction and temple founding, not because these would save individual humans from death, but because they would outlast any individual human. The knowledge was valuable not for what it could do for the person who possessed it, but for what it could do for the community that inherited it. The scribes who copied the Epic of Gilgamesh understood themselves as participants in this transmission. The tablets they produced were their contribution to what would outlast them. The story they preserved was not merely entertainment, but instruction. This is what it means to be mortal, this is what it means to seek meaning despite mortality. This is what remains when the seeker has departed. If you are drifting now, let Gilgamesh drift with you. Let the serpent carry the plant away, into whatever waters flow through your sleeping mind. The loss is already 4,000 years old. Nothing you do tonight can recover it, but the walls of the city still stand in ruins but recognizable, and the tablets still speak, and the transmission continues. In the later Enochic tradition, this pattern inverts. There, the problem is not that humans are denied divine knowledge, but that they receive too much of it. The Watchers who descend from heaven teach forbidden arts, and that teaching becomes the crime that triggers cosmic judgment. Same knowledge, different moral valence. The distinction lies not in what was transmitted, but in whether the transmission was sanctioned from above. Sleep comes when sleep is ready. Let the bread of life remain untouched on the divine table. Let the water of life stay in its cup. You already have everything you need for tonight. The Sumerian king list, best preserved on a clay prism now held in the Ashmolean Museum, records 8 kings ruled before the flood across 5 cities. Their reign lengths are impossible by any literal standard. 28,800 years for the first king, Alulim of Eridu, 36,000 for his successor Al-Aljar, 43,200 for Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tabira. The total comes to 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. Scholars have proposed various explanations for these numbers. Dwight W. Young, analysing the list in 1988, observed that all the antediluvian reign lengths except 2 to multiples of 300, which is 1 shah in the Sumerian sexagesimal system, their mathematical base of 60. The Greek historian Berossus recorded an alternative total of 432,000 years, which equals exactly 120 shah. Some researchers have suggested these numbers encode astronomical cycles. Others argue they represent symbolic rather than chronological significance, conveying the divine status of the antediluvian kings rather than the literal duration of their reigns. The day count theory proposes dividing by 360, which would yield approximately 670 years total, a more plausible but still unverifiable lifespan for 8 kings. What matters more than the specific numbers is the structure they create. A before and an after, an antediluvian world where kings ruled for impossible durations, advised by fish-cloaked sages, and a post-flood world where kingship descended again but the reign lengths shrunk to human scale. The flood is the dividing line between mythological time and historical time, between the age when the sages taught openly and the age when their teachings could only be preserved through writing and ritual. The earliest version of this king list dates to the Ur III period. around 2112 to 2004 BCE. The definitive edition, including the Weld-Blundell prism, was compiled during the Old Babylonian period around 1817 BCE. The document's political purpose is clear. It establishes Akkad as the direct heir to Kish's hegemony, providing ideological legitimacy for contemporary rulers by linking them to an unbroken chain of kingship stretching back before the flood. Even the mythological portions of the list serve concrete political functions. This is something to hold as we move through ancient texts. Mythology and ideology are not opposites. They are collaborators. Let the reign lengths extend and contract like breath. 28,000 years. 36,000. The numbers are not meant for your waking mind. They are meant for the part of you that understands things without counting. To understand what the sages were believed to have transmitted, we need to understand the ME, one of the most distinctive concepts in Sumerian cosmology. The ME, pronounced approximately like the English word may, were divine powers or decrees governing every aspect of civilized existence. Not laws that could be debated or violated, but fundamental operating principles. Rituals in which deities incarnated themselves, and yet also physical objects that could be stored, displayed and transferred. The myth of Inanna and Enki provides the most extensive catalogue. When the goddess Inanna visited Enki at Eridu, the god of wisdom became intoxicated and presented her with over 100 ME, which she loaded onto the boat of heaven and successfully transported to Uruk despite Enki's attempts to reclaim them through sea monsters at 7 stages of the journey. The categories reveal how comprehensively the Sumerians conceived of civilization. Lordship, godship, the exalted crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, shepherdship. These are powers of governance, truth, wisdom, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the metalworker, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the mason, art, music. These are powers of knowledge and skill, sexual intercourse, heroism, counsel, judgment, fear, rejoicing. These are powers of human experience itself, but the ME also included negative aspects: enmity, destruction of cities, lamentation, strife, falsehood. Civilization in the Sumerian understanding was not simply the good things that make human life pleasant. It was the entire structure of organized existence, including the capacity for conflict and loss. The ME originated with Enlil, were transferred to Enki for guardianship, and distributed from Eridu to other cities. This transfer mechanism provides the conceptual framework for understanding how the Apkallu transmitted civilizational knowledge. They were not merely teaching skills, they were conveying ME from divine to human realms, installing the fundamental operating principles that made civilization possible. This is why the claim that nothing material has been added by way of improvement makes sense within its own logic. The ME are complete. They are not innovations waiting to be discovered, but realities waiting to be received. What the sages brought was not new knowledge, but essential structure, the grammar of civilization itself. Let the ME settle into you like sediment. You already carry some of them, though no one gave them names in your language. The craft of rest, the craft of release, the power of breath held and breath let go. The great flood that marks the boundary between the age of the sages and the age of human history was not, according to Mesopotamian tradition, merely a natural disaster. It was a divine decision, reached after much deliberation to wipe out a creation that had become unbearable. The Atrahasis epic, inscribed by a scribe named Epic Aya in Sippar around 1635 BCE, provides the most detailed account. The narrative framework is economic. The Agigi gods, burdened with canal digging and agricultural labour, rebel after 40 years of toil surrounding Enlil's temple with torches. The Divine Council's solution is to create replacement workers. The creation procedure involves precise elements. Clay from the Abzu, blood and flesh of the slain god Geshtur, whose name means ear or intelligence. Ritual purification on the 1st, 7th and 15th days of the month. The birth goddess Nintu mixed the clay with divine flesh and blood, while the Igigi spat upon the clay. She pinched off 14 pieces, forming them into womb deities, 7 on the left and 7 on the right with a brick between them, producing the first 7 pairs of human embryos. The text is explicit about what this mixture achieved. From the flesh of the god the spirit remained, it would make the living know its sign. The Etamu, the spirit or ghost, explains why humans possess consciousness, and why upon death they descend to the underworld rather than simply ceasing to exist. The divine spark in human clay is not metaphor, it is ingredient, and the purpose of creation is equally explicit. The goddess Mami declares, "I have relieved you of your hard work, I have imposed your load on man." Humanity exists to bear divine labour so that gods may rest, but the creation's success breeds its own problem. After 1200 years, human population, bellowing like a bull, disturbs Enlil's sleep. Plague is attempted as a solution, Enki circumvents it. Famine is attempted, Enki finds a way around. Drought, the same. Finally, the gods agree on complete annihilation through flood, and they bind themselves with an oath not to warn humanity. Enki's circumvention is clever and perhaps characteristic. He speaks not to a human but to a reed wall. Wall, listen to me. Reed. Wall, pay attention. The flood hero, who happens to be standing on the other side of the wall, overhears the warning. Technically, no oath is broken. The flood itself lasts 7 days. When it recedes, the survivor offers sacrifice, and the gods, starving without human offerings, gather around it like flies. Even the cosmic reset has failed to change the fundamental relationship. The gods need humanity. Humanity needs the gods. The system restores itself with checks and balances, birth control, infant mortality, classes of women who do not reproduce. The arrangement is uncomfortable but stable. Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations at in 1928 to 1929 discovered an 8 to 11 foot deposit of water-laid silt at approximately 40 feet depth, containing no artifacts and dating to approximately 3500 to 4000 BCE. His wife's famous response upon seeing it, "Well, of course it's the flood. The evidence is more complicated than that initial excitement suggested." Similar deposits at Kish average less than 10 inches and date to around 3200 to 3000 BCE. At Shurapak, the deposit is 15 inches and dates to around 2900 BCE. The pottery from these different sites does not match. Eridu, just 7 miles from shows no trace of the deposit at all. The archaeologist Max Mallowan concluded that these represent local river flooding events, not a single catastrophic deluge. The Shurapak deposit, dated to around 2900 BCE at the city where the flood hero Zeus Sudra was said to have lived, provides the closest chronological match to literary tradition. It may be that a real flood, devastating to the communities it struck, generated the mythological memory of the Great Deluge. But the evidence does not support a global catastrophe. The flood myths persist because they encode something true about human experience. The fragility of what we build, the constant possibility of destruction, the thinness of the barrier between civilization and chaos. Whether or not the waters actually rose to cover the mountains, the fear that they might have shaped human imagination for at least 5,000 years. Let the waters recede. Let dry land appear. You're safe tonight above any flood that may have been or may yet come. Now we must trace a transformation that occurred over centuries as Mesopotamian traditions passed through Aramaic and Greek translations, and eventually arrived at a very different understanding of what the sages were and what they had done. The Book of Enoch, preserved complete only in Ethiopic translation, but with Aramaic fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, transforms the Mesopotamian civilizing sages into transgressive angels. The Book of Watchers, comprising chapters 1 through 36, was composed in the 4th to 3rd century BCE. It describes 200 heavenly beings descending on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, a wordplay connecting the name Hermon to the Hebrew term cherem, meaning devoted or banned, referencing the oath the Watchers swore. 2 leaders emerge from the narrative. Shemahazar, whose name means "my name has seen," led the descent. Azazel taught the most corrupting arts. Here is where I want to be careful about the contrast, because it is not simply that different cultures told the different stories. The Enochic tradition deliberately inverts the Mesopotamian tradition. What Babylon celebrated, the Watchers condemned. The taxonomy of forbidden knowledge maps directly onto the gifts the Apkallu were said to have given. Azazel taught metallurgy, specifically swords and shields and the working of precious metals. He taught cosmetics and the beautification of the face. Shemahazar taught enchantments and root cutting, which is herbal magic. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Penamue taught writing with ink and paper. These are civilizational technologies. The same technologies, in Mesopotamian tradition, that the 7 sages transmitted for the benefit of humanity. But in the Enochic text, they become the crimes for which the Watchers are condemned. The Watchers' union with human women produced the Nephilim, giants of catastrophic appetite who consumed all the acquisitions of men and devoured mankind. The corruption spreads from taught knowledge to biological corruption, and both become grounds for judgment. Azazel is bound in Dudael, the cauldron of God, beneath jagged rocks. The Watchers are imprisoned for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, until final judgment. The scholar Amar Anus at the University of Tartu has argued that this represents deliberate polemic. The mythology of Watchers and their sons, the giants, derived from inverted versions of various Mesopotamian myths and beliefs about Apkallis. The transformation is not accidental evolution or neutral transmission. It is ideological warfare. Consider the context. The Book of Watchers was composed during or shortly after the Hellenistic period, when Jewish communities lived under the cultural pressure of empires that traced their legitimacy to Babylonian and Persian traditions. To recast the foundational figures of those imperial ideologies as rebels against heaven was an act of resistance. It delegitimized Mesopotamian civilization at its mythological root, transforming divine gift into cosmic crime. The terminology itself tracks the transformation. The Sumerian and Akkadian term Apkallu, meaning sage, passes through the Akkadian Masaru, meaning guardian, from the root meaning to watch over. In Aramaic, the term becomes ear, watcher, appearing in Daniel chapter 4, a watcher, a holy one come down from heaven. In Greek, this becomes a Gregoros, from the root meaning wakeful or watchful. In Slavonic, it becomes Grigori, a transcription of the Greek. The scholar Jonathan Bendov has proposed a fascinating theory about this transformation, that the Watcher myth began when Aramaic writers interpreted imagery on Mesopotamian monuments without reading their Akkadian text. The fish-cloaked figures on palace reliefs, their function forgotten by those who could not read the accompanying inscriptions, became the basis for a new mythology generated by iconographic misreading. If this is true, it means the Watcher's tradition preserves not ancient memory, but ancient misunderstanding. What the Mesopotamians meant by these figures was lost, and what the Jewish scribes invented to explain the images they saw became its own tradition, with its own logic and its own consequences. Either way, the transformation represents something important about how cultures make sense of inherited material. The images and the structures persist. The meanings attributed to them shift according to the needs of each new community of interpreters. Let the sages become angels. Let the angels fall. These are not facts, but stories about facts, told by people with purposes. You do not need to choose between them tonight. The transformation of the Apkallu into the Watchers was not the only trajectory this tradition took. In Islamic sources, a related story appears. The tale of Harut and Marut, two angels sent to Babylon as a trial for humanity. The Quran in Surah al-Baqarah describes them teaching magic while explicitly warning those who came to learn. We are only a trial, so do not disbelieve. The story has intriguing parallels to both the Mesopotamian and the Enochic traditions. Like the Apkallu, these beings transmit knowledge to humanity. Like the Watchers, that knowledge has dangerous potential. But unlike either tradition, the Islamic version includes a built-in warning from the very beings doing the teaching. They are not deceiving humanity about the nature of what they offer. They are explicitly identifying the transaction as a test. Scholars have noted that this story parallels a Jewish legend about the fallen angels, Shemazai, Uzzah, and Azael. The Britannica Encyclopedia observes that the Islamic tradition may have influenced later Jewish midrashim rather than deriving from them, suggesting a complex web of transmission and counter-transmission between Jewish and Islamic sources in the medieval period. The direction of influence is not always clear. Ideas crossed religious boundaries, adapted to new contexts, and took on new meanings without necessarily recording where they had come from. What all of these traditions share is the premise that certain kinds of knowledge are dangerous. Metallurgy, in the Enochic account, leads to weapons. Cosmetics lead to vanity and seduction. Astrology and divination give humans access to information that perhaps they were not meant to have. The power to shape the future, or to know it in advance, carries inherent risks. The Mesopotamian tradition, by contrast, did not seem to share this anxiety. The ME that the Apkallu transmitted included both positive and negative aspects of civilization, not only kingship and wisdom, but also destruction of cities and strife. The gods had created a complete system, not a selective one. To receive the full package of civilization was to receive all of it, including the capacity for conflict and loss. This difference in attitude toward knowledge may reflect different historical circumstances. The Mesopotamian city-states developed their mythologies during a period when they were the centers of power, when their technologies represented advancement rather than threat. The Enochic tradition developed during a period of cultural pressure, when Jewish communities lived under imperial domination and needed ways to critique the civilizations that ruled over them. To call the knowledge of the oppressor forbidden was to delegitimize that oppressor at the level of cosmic origin. The question of whether knowledge itself is neutral, good, or dangerous remains open. Modern debates about technology, about artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and nuclear power echo these ancient concerns. Each new capability brings both potential benefit and potential harm. The fish-cloaked sage who teaches metallurgy creates both plowshares and swords. Breathe deeply and let these competing narratives settle into whatever arrangement feels natural. The sages taught. The watchers fell. Harut and Marut warned even as they transmitted. Each culture found its own way to express the same underlying tension. Behind all of these discussions of civilizing sages and cosmic transgressions lies the physical reality of Mesopotamian religious architecture, the ziggurat. These step pyramid structures, built of millions of mud bricks, functioned as artificial sacred mountains, permanent stairways enabling ritual approach to heaven. The ziggurat of built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, measures 64 by 45 meters at its base with an estimated original height of over 30 meters. The lower portion alone required approximately 720,000 baked bricks, with individual bricks weighing up to 33 pounds. The labour required to construct such a monument, in an age without metal tools or wheeled carts, staggers the imagination. Etemer-Nanki at Babylon, temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, likely the basis for the Tower of Babel narrative, achieved even greater scale. According to the Ark Tablet, a copy from 229 BCE of a much older document, its base measured 91 meters square with 7 stories reaching 91 meters in height, requiring approximately 17 million bricks. Modern engineers suggest the actual height was likely 54 to 66 meters, due to the structural limitations of mud brick construction. But even that conservative estimate represents an extraordinary accomplishment. These structures were not tombs or storehouses, they were cosmic interfaces. The Ekkur at Nippur was literally called bond between heaven and earth. Dur Anki, the meeting place where the divine assembly convened. The upper shrine, called the Giganu, presumably housed the divine presence. Herodotus, visiting Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described furnished bedrooms left empty for divine visitors. Access was restricted to authorized priests performing rituals that may have included sacred marriage ceremonies. There are claims in alternative literature about acoustic chambers or intentional resonance properties in ziggurats, but these lack archaeological documentation. What the evidence supports is astronomical alignment. Systematic studies using satellite imagery and GIS have shown that ziggurats were oriented to solstice and equinox sunrise and sunset positions, to major and minor lunar standstills, the 18.6-year cycle, and to Venus passages. The ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana, aligns to northern moonrise during major lunar standstill. The orientation was not accidental. These structures were designed to connect Earth to heaven, not merely symbolically, but through precise physical alignment with the movements of celestial bodies. Whatever rituals occurred at their summits occurred at cosmically significant moments. Imagine climbing the exterior staircase of the ziggurat of as the full moon rises precisely over the horizon, framed by the architecture that was designed to frame it. Whatever you believed about the gods, whatever doubts or certainties you carried, that moment would feel like more than coincidence. It would feel like appointment. The bricks are still there, some of them, worn by wind and rain but not entirely erased. Rest against them in your imagination. Feel how much labour went into connecting one point of ground to one point of sky. The question of whether any civilization preceded the known ancient civilizations, whether there were watchers who ruled before Egypt in any literal sense, finds its most dramatic evidence at a site in southeastern Turkey that has fundamentally challenged assumptions about when and how human social complexity emerged. Gobekli Tepe, excavated by Klaus Schmidt beginning in 1995, dates to 9608,000 BCE. This is approximately 6,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 4,000 years before the earliest temple at Eridu, more than 6,000 years before the pyramids of Giza. The site features multiple circular enclosures with T-shaped limestone pillars weighing 40 to 60 tons, standing 3 to 6 meters tall, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs: lions, foxes, vultures, serpents, scorpions. These are not crude marks but accomplished sculpture, created by people who had mastered stone carving techniques of considerable refinement. The revolutionary finding is what is absent from the site. Schmidt's team found no evidence of domesticated plants or animals at the earliest levels, no cooking hearths, houses, or trash pits indicating permanent habitation. Over 100,000 analysed bone fragments show butchered wild animals, suggesting ritual feasting rather than settled agriculture. This reverses the previously assumed evolutionary sequence. The standard model held that agriculture enabled surplus, surplus enabled social complexity, and social complexity enabled monumental construction. Gobekli Tepe suggests that complex social organisation and monumental construction could precede permanent settlement. Hunter-gatherers built these enclosures, gathered for ritual purposes, and did so with a sophistication that was not supposed to be possible for their mode of subsistence. Pillar 43, sometimes called the vulture stone, has attracted astronomical interpretation. Various researchers have proposed alignments to Deneb in the constellation Cygnus to Sirius to other celestial bodies. The most controversial claim, by Sweatman and Sakritsis, suggests that the pillar depicts a Yisar comet impact date in 1050 BC. This has been peer-reviewed but remains disputed. Schmidt himself interpreted the central circular element as a disembodied human head or soul symbol, rather than an astronomical marker. The site is now UNESCO World Heritage listed, designated in 2018. Approximately 10% has been excavated, suggesting significant discoveries remain buried. I want to be careful here about what Gobekli Tepe does and does not demonstrate. It demonstrates that hunter-gatherers were capable of monumental construction, complex symbolism, and sophisticated stone carving. It demonstrates that the origins of religious architecture predate the origins of agriculture. It demonstrates that conventional timelines for social complexity need revision. It does not demonstrate the existence of a lost advanced civilization with technology equal or superior to our own. It does not demonstrate extraterrestrial intervention or the literal truth of the Apkallu myths. It does not require any explanation beyond the creative capacity of human beings working together over generations toward goals we can only partially reconstruct. And yet there is something about standing before those pillars, even in photographs, that invites the question: who were these people? What did they know that we have forgotten? What else might be waiting beneath other mounds, in other places no one has yet thought to dig? The mystery of origins is not solved by Gobekli Tepe, and it is deepened. And perhaps that deepening is itself the point. 11,000 years of wind have blown across that hilltop. The pillars still stand. Let that patience settle into you, older than any empire, older than any writing, older than any story you will ever hear. Before we move to Egyptian parallels, there is something more to say about the writing that preserved these traditions, about the medium that allowed the stories of the sages to cross thousands of years and reach us at all. Cuneiform, the writing system of Mesopotamia, was not like alphabetic writing. It did not represent sounds in a simple one-to-one correspondence. Instead, it used wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay to create a complex system of signs that could function as logograms, representing whole words, or as syllables, representing sounds, or as determinatives, indicating the category of the word that followed. A trained scribe might need to know over 600 signs, with many signs having multiple possible readings depending on context. The technology itself shaped what could be transmitted. Clay tablets were heavy and fragile. They could not be rolled up and carried in a traveller's pack like papyrus scrolls. But they had one crucial advantage: they lasted. If a clay tablet was baked, whether intentionally in a kiln or accidentally in a fire, it became nearly permanent. Tablets have survived underground for 4,000 years, their surfaces still sharp enough to read. The same fires that destroyed the civilizations that produced them often preserved their records, hardening the clay into something that could outlast stone. The physical form of the tablet influenced the structure of the texts inscribed on it. Long compositions had to be divided into sections that would fit on a single tablet, with catch lines at the end of each tablet, indicating the first words of the next. Libraries organised tablets by series, with each tablet numbered and labelled. The colophon at the end of a tablet might record the name of the scribe, copied it, the date of the copying, the source text that was used, and sometimes a curse against anyone who might damage or steal the tablet. This was not primitive technology. It was sophisticated information management developed over centuries and maintained through institutional commitment. The scribal schools, the Adapa, were not casual gatherings but formal educational institutions with curricula, examinations, and standards. A student who completed the 12-year training emerged with skills that could guarantee employment for life. The craft of the scribe was prestigious, essential, and carefully controlled. The myth of Penemu, one of the watchers who taught writing with ink and paper, transforms this technology into transgression. But in Mesopotamian tradition, writing was a divine gift, associated with the goddess Nisaba and with Nabu, the god who served as scribe to the divine assembly. The ability to write was not a curse but a blessing, the skill that allowed human beings to participate in the cosmic order, to record contracts and prayers and astronomical observations, to preserve what would otherwise be lost to the forgetting that time imposes on unwritten memory. The tablets that preserve the stories of the Apkallu were themselves products of this technology, this institutional framework, this conception of writing as sacred transmission. The scribes who copied them believed they were continuing a lineage that stretched back to Adapa himself, the first sage, who had served as priest at Eridu in the age before the flood. Whether or not that lineage was historically real, the belief in it shaped how the copying was done. These were not casual notes but sacred texts, handled with care, copied with attention, preserved because they were understood to be important. Some texts were marked as pirishtu, secret knowledge, restricted to initiated priests. The Apkallu traditions themselves had this character. They were not public knowledge freely, shared but specialized learning transmitted within temple contexts. The clay figurines of the Apkallu buried in temple foundations were not public monuments but hidden protections, working their magic invisibly beneath the floors where worshippers walked. This secrecy should not be confused with conspiracy. It was standard practice in the ancient world to restrict certain types of knowledge to those who had been properly trained to receive it. Medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, ritual knowledge, all required initiation and training before transmission. The Apkallu themselves were imagined as selective in their teaching, transmitting what was appropriate to those who were ready, not broadcasting indiscriminately to anyone who might listen. The question of what the Apkallu really taught may be unanswerable. What we have are texts about what they taught, composed by scribes who believed themselves to be continuing their work. The frame is mythological, but the content is practical, temple construction, astronomical observation, medical treatment, ritual performance. These are the things that the scribal tradition actually transmitted, regardless of whether fish-cloaked sages literally emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach them. The tradition's power lies not in its literal truth, but in its explanatory function. It answered the question of where knowledge came from. It provided legitimacy for the institutions that preserved and transmitted that knowledge. It connected the present moment of copying to a cosmic past that gave the work meaning. The scribe bent over his tablet in the 7th century BCE was participating in the same activity that the sages had initiated before the flood. That continuity was itself the point. Let the wedge-shaped marks blur into patterns. Let the tablets stack in imagination like the temple levels at Eridu. Writing is itself a kind of bridge, connecting minds across time, allowing the dead to speak to the living. You are at the receiving end of a transmission that has crossed 4,000 years. Whatever you retain or forget, the act of listening continues what the scribes began. The Egyptians had their own traditions about a time when divine beings ruled directly on earth. Tepe, the first time, or the first occurrence, denotes the primordial moment when the gods established the patterns that pharaonic civilization would continue to follow. The Turin royal canon lists divine kingdoms, the reigns of Geb, Osiris, Horus, Seth, and Maat, preceding the mortal pharaohs. The historian Manetho, writing around 280 BCE for a Greek audience, calculated approximately 36,525 years for the entire span of Egyptian civilization from the time of the gods. The Netjuru, the beings we translate as Egyptian gods, resist simple categorization. The term does not map cleanly onto the Greek concept of deities as powerful immortal persons. Scholarly analysis suggests the Netjuru represent cosmic principles, laws, and forces of universal nature pervading the universe, closer to active energies than anthropomorphic individuals. The Shabaka stele from the 8th century BCE describes Netjuru entering their bodies in the form of every sort of wood, of every sort of mineral, everything which grows. Egyptian texts also reference the Urshu, a category of lesser divinities whose title meant the watchers, intermediaries between gods and humans preserving recollections of the Netjuru. The Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, positioned in the Turin Papyrus between the era of gods and human dynasties, served similar intermediary functions. They are described as neither fully human nor fully divine, associated with preserving astronomical knowledge across the transition from mythological to historical time. The structural parallels between Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions are significant. Both feature divine councils, the Ennead in Egypt, the Anunnaki in Mesopotamia. Both involve territorial diaours, divisions among deities, the nome system in Egypt, the city-god relationships in Mesopotamia. Both record extended periods of divine rule before human kings. Both include intermediate beings facilitating knowledge transmission. But these parallels emerge from distinct cosmological frameworks. Mesopotamian symbolism emphasizes water, the Abzu, the aquifer, the fresh water welling up from below. Egyptian symbolism centers on solar and stellar cycles, the death and resurrection of Osiris, the daily journey of Ra through the underworld. The Watchers who emerge from the Persian Gulf are not the same beings as the followers of Horus who preserved star knowledge through the ages, but they occupy similar positions in their respective systems. What does this suggest? Perhaps that human beings facing similar questions, who are we? Where does knowledge come from? How do we understand the relationship between divine and human? Tend to generate similar structural answers. The content differs, but the shape recurs: a golden age when gods walked among mortals, a transition period when intermediaries preserved what would otherwise be lost, and the present age when we inherit fragments of what once was whole. Or perhaps there is some connection we do not understand, some transmission of ideas across cultures that left traces in both traditions. The evidence is insufficient to decide between indigenous parallel development and ancient contact. Both remain possible. Neither is certain. Sleep gathers information from sources you do not remember. Trust it to sort what deserves preservation from what can be released. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the fish bones around an altar at Eridu to the T-shaped pillars of Gobekli Tepe, from the 7 sages emerging from the waters to the 200 watchers descending on Mount Hermon, from the antediluvian kings whose reigns lasted 36,000 years to the archaeological deposits that may or may not preserve evidence of an actual flood, from the ME, the divine powers that structure civilization, to the forbidden knowledge that corrupted it. What emerges from all of this is not a single coherent answer, but a constellation of questions that ancient peoples found compelling enough to encode in their most sacred texts and most enduring monuments. Where does knowledge come from? The Mesopotamian answer: from sages who emerged from the primordial waters before the flood, transmitting divine powers that constitute the very structure of civilized existence. The Jewish answer: from rebellious angels who transgressed the boundary between heaven and earth, teaching arts that corrupted rather than elevated humanity. Both answers agree that knowledge has a source beyond ordinary human experience. They disagree about whether receiving that knowledge was humanity's fortune or humanity's fall. Is civilization a gift or a burden? The creation account in Atrahasis is brutally honest. Humans were made to bear the labour that the gods refused to continue. We exist so that divine beings may rest. And yet within that unflattering origin story, the divine spark persists. The Atemu, the spirit that makes the living know its sign, comes from the flesh of a slaughtered god. We are workers, but we are also, in some ineradicable sense, kin to the divine. What separates the age of myth from the age of history? The flood. That is the consistent answer across Mesopotamian tradition. Before the flood, Kings ruled for thousands of years and sages taught openly. After the flood, kingship descended again, but the scale had shrunk. The Golden Age was gone, preserved only in writing and ritual. We live in the aftermath, inheriting what fragments the transition preserved. Are there lost civilizations whose knowledge exceeds our own? The evidence from Gobekli Tepe suggests that conventional timelines need revision, but it does not support claims of advanced technology or extraterrestrial intervention. What it supports is a more generous assessment of what human beings can achieve through collective effort over generations. The accomplishments are impressive enough without invoking lost continents or ancient astronauts. The question is not whether our ancestors were capable of more than we assumed. They clearly were. The question is what motivated them, what they believed they were doing when they carved those pillars and aligned those temples and told those stories about beings who came from elsewhere to teach. The answers to that question lie partially in the texts that survive, partially in the structures that remain, and partially in the silence between them where only inference can reach. You have listened to a great deal of history tonight. Some of it may have lodged in memory. Most of it will drift away by morning, leaving only impressions. That is as it should be. The fish bones around the altar at Eridu do not need you to remember them. They have already lasted 6,000 years. The pillars at Gobekli Tepe do not require your attention to continue standing. They have been waiting, patient and undefended, for 11,000 years. What these traditions offer, beyond the specific claims they make about gods and sages and floods, is a way of taking the question of origins seriously. The ancients who preserved these stories believed that where knowledge came from mattered. They believed that the present was connected to the past in ways that made preservation essential and transmission sacred. They built institutions, the scribal schools, the temple archives, the ritual calendars, to ensure that what they had received would survive to reach those who came after. We are those who came after. The clay tablets crossed 4,000 years to reach us. The temple foundations were excavated and studied, and photographed and catalogued so that we might know something of what they contained. The questions the ancients asked, about wisdom and power, about divine gift and cosmic transgression, about the source of civilization itself, are still open. The night is deep now, wherever you are. The sages have returned to the waters. The watchers have been bound beneath the mountains. The flood has receded, and kingship has descended once more, and the long process of remembering and forgetting and remembering again continues in the silence between one breath and the next. Now, the ME that governs sleep are ancient and reliable. They were transmitted before the flood and have never failed. Good night. But before the night fully claims you, let us linger a little longer. In these ancient spaces, there are details we pass too quickly, nuances that deserve their own attention, threads that connect to other threads in ways that only become visible when we slow down enough to notice them. Consider the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. When archaeologists excavated this site in the mid-19th century, they discovered over 30,000 tablets and fragments, systematically organised with colophons recording the names of scribes, dates of copying, and source materials. This was not a random accumulation of texts. It was a deliberate, comprehensive attempt to gather and preserve the knowledge of civilizations that had already been ancient when Ashurbanipal was born. Ashurbanipal himself, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, took personal pride in his scholarly achievements. He could read both Sumerian and Akkadian. He claimed to have mastered the craft of Adapa, that same first sage whose ascent to heaven and refusal of immortality we discussed earlier. In his inscriptions, he boasted of enjoying the writings on stone from before the flood. This was not metaphorical language. He meant it literally. He believed he possessed documents that predated the Great Deluge, texts that had survived the cosmic catastrophe through whatever mechanisms of preservation the gods had allowed. The library contained everything: administrative records and correspondence, medical treatises describing symptoms and treatments in remarkable clinical detail, mathematical tables and astronomical observations tracking planetary movements across decades, omens and portents, listing what it meant when certain stars appeared in certain configurations, when certain animals behaved in certain ways, when certain events coincided in certain patterns. And literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh in its most complete form, the Atrahasis creation and flood account, hymns to gods whose temples had already crumbled, and their incantation series that invoked the Apkallu for protective purposes. Nippur alone yielded 30,000 tablets, including approximately 80% of all known Sumerian literary compositions. The Temple of Shamash at Sippar contained approximately 35,000 tablets, with 800 found in situ on their original shelves during excavations in 1985 to 1986. These were not scattered caches, they were organised repositories, libraries in the full modern sense, maintained by institutions with the resources and dedication to preserve knowledge across centuries. Think about what that means. 4,000 years ago, people were systematically copying texts that were already 1,000 years old in their own time. They were training students for 12 years to master the scribal arts. They were cross-referencing documents, noting discrepancies, preserving multiple versions of important texts so that later scholars could compare them. The transmission was not perfect. Texts were lost, versions diverged. Scribes made copying errors that accumulated over generations. Some tablets were damaged by fire or water or simple age, their surfaces crumbling before they could be recopied. The library at Nineveh itself was destroyed when the Babylonians and Medes sacked the city in 612 BCE, the flames hardening some tablets into permanence while reducing others to dust. But enough survived. Enough crossed the gap between their world and ours that we can still read the names of the 7 sages. We can still piece together the story of Adapa's journey to heaven. We can still calculate roughly how long the antediluvian kings were said to have reigned, and argue about what those impossible numbers might have meant. The scribes succeeded. Their civilization fell, but their transmission held. This should matter to you, not because you need to remember every detail, but because the effort of preservation itself deserves acknowledgement. Someone, many someones, across many generations decided that these stories were worth the enormous labour of maintaining them. They sat in dimly lit rooms, copying signs onto wet clay, pressing their styluses into the surface again and again so that what they had received might survive to be received by others. Some of them probably fell asleep while working. The evidence suggests that scribal work was tedious, that mistakes increased toward the end of tablets, that boredom and fatigue were constant companions of the craft. They did it anyway. The tablets exist because people who were just as tired as you are right now kept going until the work was done. Rest, fellow wanderer. The scribes have already finished their portion. What they preserved is preserved. What was lost is lost. Nothing you do tonight can change either outcome. Let us return to the flood for a moment, because there is more to say about the Ark itself and the specifications the ancient texts provide for its construction. The Sumerian flood story, preserved on a tablet from Nippur, designated CBS 163, describes a 7-day deluge survived by Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak. The tablet is fragmentary, so we do not have complete construction details, but the narrative establishes the pattern: divine warning, boat building, survival through the catastrophe, sacrifice upon emergence, divine favour restored. The Atrahasis version adds Enki's clever circumvention of the divine oath through his famous instruction to the reed wall. The flood hero Atrahasis receives not a direct revelation, but an overheard one, and therefore the gods who swore not to warn humanity cannot be accused of breaking their word. This is characteristic of Enki, the trickster god, the god who finds loopholes, the god whose wisdom manifests in clever workarounds rather than direct confrontation with power. Gilgamesh Tablet 11 provides the most detailed specifications. The Ark is described as a perfect cube, 120 cubits in each dimension, approximately 180 feet per side, 7 stories, 9 internal divisions, 6 times cross-pinning to strengthen the structure. The scholar Irving Finkel has argued that this cubic shape resulted from scribal misunderstanding of earlier designs, a copying error that transformed a more practical vessel into a geometrically perfect but physically impossible one. But then came the Ark Tablet, published by Finkel himself in 2014. This remarkable document, dating to approximately 1750 BCE, describes not a cubic vessel but a round one, a coracle, a guffet, to use the term still employed for round boats in the region until the 20th century. The ground plan specified as 1 IQ, which is 14,400 square cubits, the diameter approximately 70 metres, wall height of 12 cubits, roughly 20 feet, 30 ribs, each 120 cubits long, construction using palm fibre rope over wooden ribs, waterproofing with 10,800 units of bitumen and pitch applied inside and out. The specifications are detailed enough that modern engineers have attempted to reconstruct the vessel. A 70-metre round boat made of rope and bitumen is not obviously impossible. Such vessels were used in Mesopotamia for millennia, circular boats stable enough for river travel, though not particularly suited for ocean navigation. Whether such a vessel could survive a catastrophic flood is another question, but the description suggests that whoever composed this text was drawing on real boat-building traditions rather than inventing from whole cloth. The bird-sending sequence appears in both the Gilgamesh version and later in the biblical account. In Gilgamesh, the survivor sends out a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which also returns, then a raven, which does not return because it found food. The text specifies, eating, bobbing up and down. The raven has found dry land, or at least floating carrion, and does not need to return to the ark. The sequence in Genesis reverses the order of dove and raven, but the mechanism is the same. Birds sent as scouts, their behaviour indicating whether the waters have receded. These parallels are not coincidental. The biblical flood account derives, directly or indirectly, from Mesopotamian sources. The literary dependence is too strong to be explained by independent invention. But the meaning assigned to the flood differs between traditions. In Gilgamesh, the gods are capricious and regretful. Enlil weeps upon seeing the devastation, and Ishtar vows never again to forget the people she has destroyed. In Genesis, the flood is moral judgment, punishment for human wickedness, with the righteous Noah preserved as the seed of a new humanity. Same narrative structure, different theological framework. The wool blanket of narrative covers you now as the waters covered the earth. Let the flood be metaphor if it must. Let it be memory if it can. Either way, it recedes. The dry land returns. The rainbow, or whatever sign your tradition offers, marks the promise of continuity. The divine hierarchy of Mesopotamia deserves more attention than we gave it earlier. The Anunnaki were not a single category, but a structured bureaucracy with clearly defined functions and territories. Anu, whose ruling number was 60 in the Mesopotamian system of divine numerology, occupied supreme authority as sky god and father of the gods. He rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs, but he provided the ultimate source of divine legitimacy. His seat was Uruk, the city that would later become the largest in the world, and his decisions were binding on gods and humans alike. Enlil, with the ruling number 50, served as executive power. His temple was at Nippur, the religious centre of the Sumerian world, a city that changed hands among competing powers, but whose temples were never destroyed because all parties recognised its sacred neutrality. Enlil controlled the Tablet of Destinies, that curious object that functioned like a combination of divine constitution and magical artifact. Whoever possessed the tablet ruled the universe. Its loss or theft became the occasion for cosmic crisis narratives. The Anzu myth dramatises this most vividly. Anzu, a lion-headed storm eagle, steals the Tablet of Destinies while Enlil is bathing. With the tablet in his possession, Anzu can manipulate reality itself. Arrows shot at him disassemble in midair. Time reverses at his command. The cosmic order threatens to collapse entirely before the warrior god Ninurta, calling on the south wind to rip Anzu's wings, finally recovers the tablet and restores it to Enlil. In the later Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that established Marduk's supremacy, the tablet passes through different hands. Tiamat, the Chaos Dragon, bestows it on her consort Kingu before the cosmic battle. Marduk's defeat of Kingu and seizure of the tablet legitimizes Babylon's claim to supremacy over the older Sumerian and Akkadian religious centers. The tablet is less a mystical artifact than a constitutional document, legal proof of irrevocable sovereignty, and its possession justifies political claims that extend from the mythological past into the historical present. Enki, with the ruling number 40, occupied the position of divine problem solver. His temple at Eridu, the oldest in Mesopotamia, marked him as one of the primordial powers, but his domain was not kingship or executive authority, it was wisdom, trickery, fresh water, and the transmission of knowledge. He created the Apkallu. He preserved humanity through the flood by his clever evasion of the divine oath. He guarded the Emi, the divine powers, and distributed them from Eridu to the other cities. When the gods needed someone to think around a problem rather than through it, they turned to Enki. The Anunnaki were divided administratively, 300 assigned to heaven, 300 to earth and the underworld. The Igigi served as junior divine labourers until their rebellion, which triggered the creation of humanity as replacement workers. 7 Anunnaki served as underworld judges alongside Ereshkigal, possessing the Eye of Death and rendering irreversible verdicts. This hierarchical divine governance provided the template that earthly kingship imitated. Kings were shepherds, appointed by the gods to tend the human flock. Their legitimacy derived from the divine assembly's decision, not from military conquest or hereditary right alone. This is not how modern people typically think about government. We imagine authority as deriving from consent, or from constitutional process, or from practical necessity. The Mesopotamians imagined it as a reflection of cosmic structure. What happened in heaven determined what was proper on earth. The relationship between divine and human was not separation, but hierarchy. The gods were not above the world looking down, they were the pattern that the world was supposed to follow. Rest in that pattern if it offers comfort. Let the numbers assign themselves, 60, 50, 40. Let the territories distribute, sky, wind, water. The cosmic bureaucracy has its procedures. You're not responsible for them tonight. The Hermetic tradition deserves a brief mention here, though it takes us far from Mesopotamia in both space and time. In Hellenistic Egypt, during the centuries surrounding the turn from BCE to CE, a body of texts emerged attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. This figure represented a fusion of the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth, both associated with writing, magic, and the transmission of sacred knowledge. The Hermetic texts claim to preserve ancient Egyptian wisdom, passed down through initiates across countless generations. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus was treated as an actual historical person, a priest-king who had lived in the remote past and left writings that could still be studied and applied. Renaissance scholars took these claims seriously. They believed they were recovering knowledge more ancient than Moses, wisdom that predated the biblical revelation itself. Modern scholarship has demonstrated that this was not the case. The Hermetic texts were composed in Hellenistic and Roman Egypt probably between 200 BCE and 300 CE. As the historian Francis Yates established, they were certainly not written in remotest antiquity by an all-wise Egyptian priest, but by various unknown authors, all probably Greeks. The claims of ancient lineage encoded legitimacy rather than historical transmission. But this does not mean the Hermetic tradition was merely deception. It was a sincere attempt to synthesize Greek philosophy with what its authors understood of Egyptian priestly traditions. The result was a distinctive spiritual worldview that emphasized the divine nature of the human soul, the correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, and the possibility of spiritual ascent through knowledge and practice. These ideas influenced alchemy, astrology, and esoteric Christianity for more than 1,000 years. What the Hermetic tradition shares with the Apkallu mythology is the idea that essential knowledge has been transmitted from a primordial source through authorized intermediaries. The sages who taught humanity civilization, the priests who preserved their teachings, the initiates who received them in each generation. This is a pattern that recurs across traditions that had no direct contact with each other. It suggests something about how human beings tend to conceptualize wisdom, as old as inherited, as requiring authorized transmission rather than individual discovery. Whether this pattern reflects some actual historical reality of knowledge transmission, or whether it reflects a persistent human need to believe that wisdom comes from beyond ourselves, is a question that the evidence cannot definitively answer, perhaps both. Perhaps the pattern is so common because it is in some sense true. Most of what we know we learned from others who learned it from others before them, a chain stretching back beyond memory into the origins of human culture. Your eyes grow heavy. The chain of transmission includes you now. What you have heard tonight joins what you heard before and what you will hear after, and all of it shapes the understanding you carry without knowing you carry it. Let us speak briefly about the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus in Egyptian tradition. The Turin Royal Canon, papyrus that lists Egyptian kings from the mythological past to the historical present, positions these beings between the era of divine rule and the first human pharaohs. They are described as neither fully human nor fully divine, a transitional category that bridged the gap between the age of the gods and the age of mortals. The followers of Horus were associated with preserving astronomical knowledge. They appear in contexts related to the foundation of temples, the orientation of sacred structures, the maintenance of calendrical calculations. Their function, like that of the Apkallu, was transmission, ensuring that what the gods had established would continue to be observed by their human successors. The structural parallel is striking. Mesopotamian tradition had the 7 sages who taught civilization before the flood. Egyptian tradition had the followers of Horus, who preserved divine knowledge through the transition to human rule. Both traditions imagined intermediate beings, neither fully god nor fully human, whose purpose was to carry wisdom from one era to the next. The content of the wisdom differed. The emi that the Apkallu transmitted included everything from kingship to sexual intercourse, from truth to destruction of cities. The knowledge associated with the Shemsu Hor was more specifically astronomical and ritual, focused on the proper observation of celestial cycles and the correct performance of temple ceremonies. But the structure was the same, a golden age of divine presence, a period of transition mediated by special beings, and the present age of human effort to maintain what was received. This parallel suggests either common influence, some ancient connection between Egyptian and Mesopotamian thought that we can no longer trace, or independent development, 2 different cultures facing similar questions and generating similar answers. The evidence is insufficient to decide between these possibilities. We know there was contact between Egypt and Mesopotamia, trade and diplomacy, and the exchange of ideas across the ancient Near East. But we cannot point to a specific moment when the concept of divine sages passed from one tradition to the other, or identify the direction of influence if there was one. Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps what matters is the underlying human question. How do we account for the fact that we know things? Where did the first knowledge come from before there were teachers and students, before there was writing and reading, before the institutions that preserve and transmit were themselves established? Every culture that has thought about this question has had to imagine some kind of origin point. The Sumerians imagined fish-cloaked sages rising from the vast Persian Gulf. The Egyptians imagined divine rulers and their semi-divine followers establishing the patterns of civilization. The Greeks imagined Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. The Jews imagined a garden where knowledge was forbidden and a serpent who tempted humanity to eat it anyway. The answers differ. The question is universal. Sleep does not require answers, it requires only the willingness to let the questions rest, to let them settle like sediment in water, to trust that they will still be there in the morning if they still matter. We have not spoken enough about the physical experience of these ancient sites, and I want to remedy that before the night concludes. Imagine, if you can, standing at the base of the Ziggurat of Ur on a morning in the 21st century BCE. The structure rises above you in 3 enormous tiers faced with fired brick. Its corners oriented to the cardinal directions. You cannot see the top from where you stand, the angle is too steep, the structure too massive. The staircase that leads upward is not the gentle incline of a modern ramp. It is a statement of purpose. Mortals may approach the divine, but they must work for the privilege. The bricks beneath your feet are stamped with royal inscriptions. Namu, king of Ur, builder of temples. The mud that formed them was dug from the banks of the Euphrates. The labour that shaped and fired and carried and laid them was the labour of thousands, citizens fulfilling their corvée obligations, slaves captured in war, professionals whose entire lives were devoted to the craft of building. Some of those builders are buried nearby in graves that archaeologists would not open for another 4,000 years. The air smells of dust and incense. The temple servants have been awake since before dawn, preparing offerings, cleaning, implements, rehearsing the rituals that will be performed when the priests ascend. You can hear them chanting faintly from somewhere above. The words are in Sumerian, a language already ancient, preserved because the gods prefer to be addressed in the tongue of the first prayers. If you had the authority to climb, if you were priest rather than labourer or merchant or farmer, you would ascend those stairs as the sun rose. You would reach the uppermost platform as the light touched it, standing where the god Nana was believed to descend on certain nights, where the sacred marriage might be enacted, where heaven and earth met in the person of the high priestess representing the divine. What would you feel in that moment? Perhaps the satisfaction of having reached a place that most people would never see. Perhaps fear of the divine presence that the temple was designed to attract. Perhaps boredom, if you had done this many times before and the ritual had become routine. Perhaps profound religious experience, the sense of standing at the intersection of cosmic forces. We cannot know. We can only imagine. The ziggurat still stands, partly reconstructed in modern Iraq. The rituals have not been performed for more than 2,000 years. Whatever it felt like to stand at that summit in the age when the temple was living and active, that feeling is lost to us, preserved neither in clay tablets nor in stone inscriptions, but the structure remains. The orientation to the cardinal directions remains. The astronomical alignments that connected earthly architecture to celestial movement remain verifiable with modern instruments. Whatever meaning the people of Ur assigned to their temple, they built it to last, and it did. Let that persistence comfort you. What was built with care tends to endure. What was oriented with precision holds its alignment across millennia. The meaning may be lost, but the form persists, waiting for someone to ask what it meant. The night is very late now or very early, depending on how you measure. The stars that the ancient observers tracked are still above you. The same stars in the same patterns, though the names have changed and the stories attached to them have transformed beyond recognition. The constellation the Mesopotamians called Mul. Mul, and we call the Pleiades, was one of the markers they used to organise their calendar. Its heliacal rising, the moment when it first became visible on the eastern horizon before dawn, signalled the beginning of the agricultural year. When the Pleiades rose, it was time to plant. When the Cebadid dawn, they set in spring, it was time to harvest. The stars told the farmers what to do, not through mystical revelation, but through careful observation repeated across generations until the patterns became reliable. The star they called Nibiru, the crossing point, marked the place where the celestial equator intersected with other significant celestial paths. This was not a rogue planet or a harbinger of doom, at least not in the original texts. It was a navigational marker, a way of organising the overwhelming complexity of the night sky into categories that could be taught and remembered and applied. The constellation they associated with the flood hero, what we might call the region of Aquarius and nearby stars, held special significance in texts dealing with the Great Deluge. When certain stars rose in that region, when certain planetary configurations appeared there, the ancient observers noted it as connected to the mythological past of the flood and the promised future of its non-repetition. All of this is still accessible to us. The stars have not changed in the 4,000 years since the earliest astronomical tablets were inscribed. If you know where to look and when to look, you can still observe the heliacal rising of the Pleiades. You can still track Jupiter's passage through the constellations. You can still understand in some partial way what the ancient observers were seeing when they pressed their records into clay. They did not have telescopes. They did not have mathematical models of orbital mechanics. They had only their eyes and their patience and their certainty that the patterns they observed meant something worth preserving. And they were right. The patterns they recorded are still valid. The predictions they made about celestial events still work. Whatever else we may doubt about their cosmology, their basic observational astronomy was sound. This is the inheritance. Not mystical revelation from fish-cloaked sages perhaps, but something equally remarkable. The accumulated careful observation of generations, preserved in writing and transmitted across catastrophes, surviving the fall of empires and the death of languages to reach us in a form we can still understand and verify. Rest now, truly. The watchers, whoever they were, have done their watching. The sages, whoever they were, have finished their teaching. The flood, whatever it was, has receded. The tablets, whatever they contain, have been translated and catalogued and made available to anyone who wishes to read them. The mystery of origins remains unsolved, but it no longer requires your attention. Let it settle into the sediment of your sleeping mind, joining all the other mysteries you have encountered and will encounter, forming layers that will compress over time into something like understanding or something like peace. The fish bones around the altar at Eridu are still there, beneath the mound. The pillars at Gobekli Tepe still stand in their circles. The library tablets, those that survived, rest in climate-controlled vaults in museums across the world. The tradition continues, even now, even here, in this transmission from one voice to another, one listener to another, across whatever distance separates us. Good night for the final time. May your sleep be as patient as the clay that waited 4,000 years to be read. May your dreams be as strange and rich as the myths that crossed languages and cultures to reach you. May whatever wisdom you have received, from whatever source, be preserved within you and transmitted when the time is right to whoever needs it. The sages have returned to the water. The watchers have ceased their watching. The kings whose reigns were measured in tens of thousands of years have yielded to kings whose reigns are measured in years and months and days. And you, who have listened this long, are free now to drift. Sleep well.